and welcome to day 10 of Can Month. Today I'm going to be talking about Fire and Ice, the United States, Canada, and the Myth of Converging Values by Michael Adams. So this book is about debunking the myth that the values of Canadians and Americans are converging, and he is arguing that they are actually diverging and becoming more different. And I love this topic. The comparative differences between the US and Canada is like one of my favorite subjects in political science. The general story as to why Canada and the US are quite different from the political science perspective is the fragment theory, which was created by some white academic guy. It's basically that the United States as a nation was created out of a revolution and an overthrowing of traditional authority. And then a lot of the loyalists in the US who lost out on the revolution moved to Canada and then brought over and maintained the sort of Canadian deference to authority, respect for tradition, that kind of thing. That theory explains a teeny tiny fraction maybe of why there is such massive differences, and it's very Eurocentric, and it's been criticized heavily, but it is something that he mentions in the beginning of the book. He has this whole methodology that he explains at the beginning of the book for how he came to all of his research findings, because he conducted all of this through value surveys. By value, he just means a base motivator for human behavior. He has a list of all the values that he used in the surveys. So there are things like acceptance of violence, active government, gender parity, flexible gender identity, obedience to authority, personal expression, stuff like that. He explains his whole methodology and how he conducted everything, and in the appendices too, he goes through how all the surveys worked, and he compiled all the research. If you're interested in that, they are really good and really detailed. He also uses a lot of graphs and stuff too, which I think is really helpful. For instance, he uses the quadrants. This is where he's assigned where all the different values fall into the different quadrants. So there's status and security, authenticity and responsibility, exclusion, intensity, and idealism and autonomy. And one of the things that I think is really interesting, you can't really see, but the thicker black line is the US, and this is the time progression of how the values have shifted. So we see the US kind of covers all three of the first ones here, but Canada is always concentrated in the idealism and autonomy quadrant. This is also true if you look at the regional divide that he does as well. So again, this is the same value quadrant. You can't really tell, but all of the American regions are over the first three quadrants, but Canada is concentrated just in the one quadrant again. He also talks about the main founding principles of Canada and the US too. So in Canada, in our Constitution as established by the Fathers of Confederation, one of which I'm related to, actually, and we have the same birthday, is peace, order, and good governance. Whereas in the US, it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. One of his main arguments of the book is that the pursuit of happiness has basically become the pursuit of the American dream. And a lot of what's wrapped into the American dream is a lot of material wealth, essentially. He's arguing that the pursuit of the American dream has basically led to chaos in the United States in terms of how individualistic people have come and what people are willing to do in order to achieve the American dream. So because it's so chaotic, that people in the United States have actually started to have to become more deferential to traditional authority structures. So the patriarch in a traditional nuclear family and the government. He does layer in other factors and values. I don't know if I totally buy his argument. Part of that might just be because he's coming from the perspective of being a pollster, and so all of his research is based on these value surveys, and to me that just doesn't feel enough to be making an evidence-based argument. And there was one thing he talked about too, which I was hoping he was going to talk about because I think it's so interesting, and that's the differences in media ratings between Canada and the US. So in the US, violence and swearing are rated as lower than sex or nudity, whereas in Canada it's the total opposite. Violence and swearing tend to be higher rated than just nudity or sex. So HBO shows in the US are regular shows in Canada, regular broadcasting. Or they used to be, maybe it's a little bit different now. Interesting too, because I've actually observed this because there are a lot of American students that are at my university, even just hearing them talk about things. Like, I've heard people go off about how Game of Thrones is like too much porn. Like, they can't deal with it. It's porny, softcore, can't deal. Whereas they're like fine with everything else, including the like mass amounts of violence, but like saw a titty too much. When he was doing his regional analysis, he also included a age analysis and a gender analysis, and I hated his gender analysis. And no, people who say it's because I don't like any analysis that isn't my own on gender, that is not true. I hated his because he leaned way too much into the biological argument. In all the other areas of analysis, he like had an argument or something he was trying to say, but in this one, he was just like, well, some people say that it's all about biology, and some people say it's all about sociology and social factors and learned behavior. But most people think it's like somewhere in the middle, which, where are you getting off on that? I do not have time for biological essentialism. I don't have a single second for that shit. And when he was talking about women as a subgroup in his study, the only difference that he talked about from just, you know, the general study was women and their fertility and if they were having children or not. And I don't know if you've ever met a woman, but there's more about their lives that's different and unique because of them being a woman than the ability to have children. Some of the other comparative issues he talked about were citizenship, secessionist movements, and how that's basically been shut down in the US, whereas that's still like a huge thing in Canada with Quebec. Bilingualism, political power, and voting apathy. Another thing I thought was really interesting, he talked about how during the Cold War, how the US responded to the USSR, the Soviet Union, became like a divergence between Canada and the US, and how that was one of the events that led to a shift in values. There was way too much Canadian sensationalism in this book though. Like, he's writing from the perspective as a Canadian, trying to prove that we're not like Americans. He would go on and on about all the terrible stuff that happens in the US and then kind of gloss over it in the Canadian context. He actually played into the foundation myth, like I talked about earlier, where like English Canada, French Canada, and Indigenous peoples were seen to be equal partnerships that created the state, even though that's completely untrue. So that was bad. It would be interesting to see if he had written this book now, though, because this book was published in 2004, but most of the results and surveys were compiled a bit before that, because under the rule of Stephen Harper that has lasted for way too many years, there has been many arguments about how we've become more Americanized, even if that's just in our politics, particularly foreign policy. Like, what the hell is going on with that? So it'd be interesting to see if his findings would actually be different now than they were when he did them earlier. The book was very interesting. Like, I tabbed off so much stuff and there's so much writing throughout the whole book, but at the same time, it's still a bit surfacey. Like, there wasn't a massive critical analysis. It's interesting, but it's also kind of lacking, if that makes sense.